So I plumbed up, I found my mark, so I've gone to my left, which is very, very important because of that wind. Lastly, I just want to jump back a little bit now and revert back to shotting that I mentioned. So the reason I've got it shotted in the way I have in that bottom, what are we on today? We're on bottom quarter of the rig, with it being about 3 foot, is what I want to create is when I lay my rig in, I want to create a lovely fluent curve through my rig. Yeah, I don't want to plumb up. So I've just got a bristle showing. If I were to plumb up with just a bristle showing, right in my spot, then my rig would be dead straight. It'd have to be perfect. Yeah, at every single time, it'd have to be perfect. But also, any movements on my float would be transferred onto my bait and they make my bait move, make it a little bit unnatural. So instead, if you haven't noticed when we zoomed in, when we were plumbing up, I plumbed up to pretty much the middle of my body. And what that does, that gives me a little bit of allowance to actually create a curve in my rig when I put it in. Yeah? So what I need is a nice fluent curve. So when I pull my rig in, it's not stuck in my finger from left to right. I don't know if the camera can get that. I'm almost creating that sort of thing. And by having a nice spread out form of shotting, it allows that to happen because there's no solid bulk that wants to swing directly beneath the float, which it would if there was a bulk. If there was a bulk, it'd always be directly beneath the float at all times because it's the only weight to the float pretty much. And then my hook length would be kicking off at an angle, which could potentially create a slack line if the fish were to move in a certain way. Whereas by having my shot nice and spread, they're probably, 2 inches apart, so I can make that nice little curve in my rig. So with that little bit of allowance that I've made when plumbing up, that will allow my float to move about a little bit, because it's always going to move. If Rich manages to really zoom in on it later, it's amazing how many little movements are happening on your float that are just naturally happening with water movements, me being wobbly bob with my pole, whatever else. Your float always does move slightly, but it allows that to happen without it transferring onto my bait and allows me to keep my bait lovely and still right over that little pile that I am trying to achieve. Right, so just before we introduce any bait to the peg, I want to have a little focus on using the correct type of pots, which is another thing that people don't seem to get the gist of, is using the correct type of pot to introducing the bait in the correct way can make a massive, massive difference instead of just filling your pot willy-nilly, chucking your bait in and waiting for a fish to come along. It's definitely not the right way to go. So in today's case, I've got a little diddy pot, which stops me there's completely no chance almost of me overfeeding, because I've got such a nice small pot. And if you can see, I've got the options of either a nice sprinkle lid, that if I want to attract fish into my peg, that again I'm going to talk about in a minute as we're fishing, or I can pop that lid off at any time and I can feed a greater volume in one go. I can make it go down in a nice little lump, which is actually how I'm going to start. It's how we're going to put some bait in a nice little lump form to create that ultimate trap that I'm trying to set up. So, a little bit of water on him. So I've discarded my lid. I'm going to grab one of my little expander pellets. I'm going to go with a normal expander. I'm going to go with 4mm. Just to see, so it's nice and warm, or warmish. We've got about 10 degrees today. So fish should be feeding. So I'm going to start with the thingy, start with a 4mm, and I can always go smaller from there. If it was colder, then I wouldn't even have 4mm with me. I'd just go straight with the 3mm, or as a little sneaky thing, I put a micro pellet on the hook. So with those micro pellets I showed you this morning, so they've swollen up now to, you know what I mean, they're massive. They're probably 2.5, 3mm, great big individual pellets. So I've got the option of putting them on the hook. That is one of my biggest edges during the winter, is putting a micro pellet on the hook when it's so hard when you're feeding 5 or 6 micro pellets and you're sitting and waiting. By having a micro on the hook, there's no odd one out. So my theory about expanders is, I might have said this before, is that whenever a fish eats it, it ends up in the keep net. So why would they continue eating them? I definitely think they're a bit more cautious than we think of expanders, but maybe that's just in my head, I don't know, we'll see. So, enough babbling. I'll have a little tiny pinch of micro pellet. Let me get a new one. Little tiny pinch of micro pellets, and I'm actually going to squeeze them into a bit of a lump. Yeah, but it's a nice little flat lump like that. Little tiny pyramid it is, pretty much. Just a lump of micro pellets, and they're all going to break up into nice individual pellets on the way down. And I'm just going to touch them into the pot so they stick in my pot nice. So they're going to sink down a good percentage of the water in lump form, which keeps them tighter as long as they go down. I don't want them to stay in the lump when they get to the bottom. I want them to break up really quickly, which they will. But at the same, I don't want them to go down in a sprinkle and spread a little bit more until I know what's in my peg. So with everything lined up, hopefully I won't spill these halfway across the canal, because we've got a bit of a tricky roller situation going on with this otter fence behind us. So right, I want to get into this similar routine every single time I go in. So I've got my leg against my box leg. I'm shipping out to my mark, which is my far bank marker, and to my pole where I was holding my pole. And now I'm going to get right in line with that. Forget about my rig for the minute. And I'm going to put my bait in. I'm just going to turn that pot over, just sink my pot under the water to let it release, give it a little tap, and that bait's gone in. That tiny little pile has fallen in, and it's as accurate as it can possibly be on the bottom. Now what I'm going to do is swing my rig to the left. So as long as because I'm at an angle, any time I swing the rig to my left-hand side, it's going to be in deeper water. So my rig's never going to be bunched up on the bottom. Give that a little tweak as you try it out a little bit. My rig's never going to be over depth on the bottom. It would be if I went from right to left and put it in the other way, because the shelf's closer to me this side. So by letting it sink in that way and holding my float right above my marker and making sure it doesn't move, what it's going to do, it's going to fall into that slope and just touch that slope, but maintain that tight line and that arc all the way through, but still right over the pile of bait I've just put in, because I've got that little 2 or 3 inch square, or left and right, that 2 or 3 inch line, where I can pull my float and it's going to stay still. So now I know I'm sat there and my rig's set, but my bait's probably an inch and a half to the left of my float. Yeah, but that's helping, because the wind's blowing this way, you'll see that my float's just slightly at an angle. So it's actually pulling in, there's a little indication then, it's pulling in and keeping my whole rig tight, which in turn shows everything up. It shows whether there's fish present in my peg with a few little movements like we just had, or it shows a nice magnified bite, because I've got so many big shot close to the bottom. As soon as a fish touches that pellet, it's almost registering on my float, the pellet, other than it being a little bit too light, but it is anchoring my bait still. But as soon as a fish moves that pellet and intercepts or moves that first number 9 shot, I'm going to get a little dip, and it's going to magnify my bite and make it look better. What I can actually do to check that I am anchored is give it a little tweak and actually pull on my float and see how that was actually a bite as it went in. What I'll be able to do this time, hopefully, when it's settled, is pull on my float, and it should actually go a little bit low on my float in the water. Hopefully the camera will pick that up really good with it being zoomed in. If I just let that settle, see, it all settles nice. See, I may have gone, right, so if I give it a little pull, that should go really, really low in the water like that, but then I can release it and it'll pop up. See how my float's coming up just a few mil, do you know what I mean? No massive differences, but it'll come up 2 or 3 mil higher, but then you know your arc is still happening, and you can just check that at any time. You can just lean into it by using a back shot, which I always have in between my float and my pole. I can just push that back shot a bit lower in the water and slowly pull my pole to the right, and again my float goes lower, so I'm creating a tighter arc, if you like, which shows my pellet up. Shows my pellet is clearly on my bait still, it's anchoring on the bottom, and in turn it'll magnify bites even further. It'll let me see exactly what's going on, and as a little additional bonus, it also shows whenever a fish is present in my peg. So with this style of fishing, you're not looking for great big numbers, you're not catching hundreds of pounds of fish, you're looking at 30-40 pound of fish being a good weight on many occasions. So having the benefit of being able to read my peg, to actually see if there's anything's been present, I can understand that whether there's any bait left in my peg, whether I'm still fishing over a pile, or whether it is actually worth sitting on that line because there's been a fish present. You know what I mean? I've seen several little movements, like I have seen in this case, to tell me that, yeah, there's some fish in my swim. Sit there, wait, put the time in, I'll catch one, as long as I'm still fishing over some bait and they haven't eaten it all. So that's not a luxury you have, unfortunately, with the lighter rigs we're going to use later with maggots. So for my pellets, it definitely stacks the odds in my favour of being able to understand my peg so much more clearly as to what's going on. So, let's say I've put my bait in this first cast, I've put it in lump form. I mean, put a little tiny pile. I actually think I'm just off it, if I'm honest. I pulled my float a bit too much that previous cast. Just trying to demonstrate that, and I probably moved it 3 or 4 inches to the right of where it needed to be. So I'm going to put it back right over me spot. You see, I'm actually holding my pole to the right of my float just to help that arc happen. So if it was a bit windier, the wind will do it for you, and then I can actually hold the pole to the left, which makes it a bit more comfortable, or the left of my float. It'll make it a bit easier to see, but in today's case, because there's very little wind actually pushing, although the water's moving that way, I've got to help it along a little bit, just by putting my back shot to the right-hand side, again, to create that arc that I keep talking about. So my pile's in. I've had a couple of little indications over that pile, one bit of a bite. So that tells me that the 12, 15 micro pellets I fed initially, fish responded to them quite quickly and something ate them. Yeah, something ate them, and more worryingly, something more than likely disturbed them as well. So when those micro pellets are on the bottom, they're in a such small tight pile and they're on an incline, it's very, very easy for a fish to come in, mess those pellets up, eat a few of them, give me a bite, whatever, and it almost wipes my pile out, it wipes my trap out that I've created. So if I feel that's happened, because of watching my flow, all of a sudden I had indications, then I don't, then I come back and I introduce it again and see what impact it has, just to see how quick they're coming in and eating that bait. So after a few seconds without an indication, I'm going to whiz in. I'm going to do it again, just again a little tiny pile of pellets, probably 10, 15 pellets at the most, in a really little tiny pile. Sneak them in, give them a little squish in just to give me a better chance of keeping them in. So another little pile in. So hopefully get him across without any spillage. So everything's nice, slow, smooth and accurate. The last thing I want to do is spill any of that bait in the wrong area and give the fish an option of feeding somewhere else. So line everything up, little dunk, little tap, lovely. I mean, that pile's gone back in. Hopefully I'm going to be sitting over the trap in a few seconds. Just going to leave it a couple of seconds just so it gets down and gets into place, because it's still going to take a few seconds to actually sink that little pile. And now I can swing my hook bait in, all nice and slow. Oh, that liked that one, didn't it? So it's almost been the same again. As soon as I've introduced bait, I'm getting a response. It definitely tells me today that they're racing in quite quick. That's 2 casts in a row where within seconds of feeding, within 20 seconds or there, immediately after feeding, fish are coming in and eating my bait. So if that's happened, I don't know how much of that pile has actually got to the bottom and whether I'm actually fishing over anything, because I've had an indication so quickly. It could be that there's a few there and they're intercepting that bait right away as soon as it's going through the water. But I'll give it a few seconds, assume that I'm still over a trap. And if I don't get a bite or don't get an indication, I'll do it again. Do you know what I mean? If something's happened, I mean, I've seen an indication on my flow, there's every chance that my bait's gone. I mean, it's only a tiny, tiny pile of bait. It only takes one F1 or carp to come in there and it'll deplete most of the pile. I won't be fishing over anything. So I'll give this a few seconds and it may be an option of maybe increasing my feed, maybe feeding twice as much, because I can see it's getting eaten really quick. And by maybe putting twice as much in, that was a big lad that then, it'll give my a slightly longer window of activity after I've fed when I'm likely to get a bite, because my bait isn't getting eaten too quickly. But we'll see how this goes. So at the minute, I'm quite happy that at least they're responding to my pile. I mean, there's fish in the area, and the last thing I want to do is feed over the heads when there's fish already present. So by putting the pile in, I'm giving myself the best chance of keeping them on the deck and getting nice clean bites over them, because I'm not feeding, I'm not loose feeding, I'm not having bait sprinkling through the water on top of the heads of fish that are already there. Because if I were to do that, then it makes them start looking up. And if they start looking up, then they can be very, very, very difficult to catch. So I've not had a bite again there. So another 20 seconds, and I am going to feed again just to see. So it's about reading your peg, about reading what's happening, and doing what you've got to do, depending on what the fish are telling you how they want to feed on the day. So a few seconds. It seemed I had a little bit of a movement then, telling me there was a fish there, so it may be worth waiting a second. So the issue that we haven't got today, of course, is it's a little bit harder to make decisions because we've got no one to watch. So if we talk about that a little bit in a match, watching how other people's pegs are behaving can help you massively in the decisions that you make at whether you do actually need to start attracting fish into your swim, because there's already the people of 5 or 6 fish ahead of you or whatever. If you're falling behind, then you need to do something about it. If we were in this position, however, and we'd had a few indications but hadn't caught one, and everyone else was in the same boat, then there's no need to change. I mean, just sit and be nice and patient and wait for something to happen, wait for the fish to start feeding everywhere, instead of taking your risk, feeding in a different way, feeding a little bit more bait, and potentially blowing your peg. So I'm going to feed once more with that little pot. I'm going to see what happens, see if they're feeding that, and if not, I'm going to swap my feed in and I'm going to attract some fish into my peg. Right, so I've just had another little pile in, and I had a little bit of a wobble again straight away as it went in, but I never caught one. So what I'm actually going to do now is try and attract more fish into my swim. So I put my little sprinkle top on that's going to help me pellets stay in, and I've half filled my pot with, same again, probably 10, 15 pellets, but loose. So they're all going to sprinkle out of my pot as and when I want them to. And hopefully the added attraction of bait falling through the water instead of sinking in one lump will serve to attract a few fish into my peg. Obviously it wouldn't have the same attraction purposes if I could make some noise with, say, 4 mils, like hard pellets or other baits, maggots and casters even. But it's the best I can do with micro pellets. It's the best I can use them, if you like, to attract fish into my peg. But with this one, I'm going to feed it a little bit different. And it's pointless me putting my bait in before my rig, because it's going to all sink down in a little pile. I want to see what impact me feeding in this way is going to have. So I'm going to put my rig in, and I'm just going to tap a few, just like that, just so a few pellets fall over the top of it. I think I put that slightly too far up the slope. I'm just going to put that back in again quickly. Just, let's see, an inch closer to me. I always do that. I always stretch a little bit as I start fishing for some reason. That's better. So that sank nice and low. So yeah, once my rig settled, I'm just going to tap a few. So actually leave my pot facing upwards or just at a slight angle, and just give it a little tap, just so a few pellets every now and again come into my peg, and say it's for attraction. That's why I'm doing it. I'm not doing it to feed the fish that are there. I'm doing it because I need to attract new fish into my peg. And you see how quickly that's happened. On a peg where nothing was really happening, with a plain little pile falling through the water, sitting on the bottom, instead the bait falling through the water has dragged some new fish into the peg, because that's where they want to be today. So it's a little bit warmer. They don't quite want to be in this sort of depth. So that additional bait falling through's made one go down, get it, and sparks it off into me having getting a bite quicker. The one thing I will say though, is I do not want to feed that way too often if there's plenty of fish in my peg, because like I said, that's going to make them come up. So what I tend to try and do is swap between using this pot to attract a percentage into my peg, and then once they're there, I'll swap to back to taking the lid off and go back to the lump, just to try and concentrate them and keep them where I want them. And in turn, hopefully, that leads to a lot more positive bites without the chance of overfeeding, which will end up with a few more fish in the net. Right, so that's my basic principles of how I'd actually fish pellet. Of course, there's other things that have to be included in that, and about choosing the right depth of the day. But if I talk about that quickly now, yeah. So today's case, I chose 3.5 foot. So I think I've done a video of this before on one of the F1's. And the basic rules I go with the depth that I choose, is that by starting in 3.5 foot, it's sort of the general middle depth on your slope. You know what I mean? Generally, I'll fish 3.5, maybe in 2.5 foot if it's really good. If there's enough fish present, I'll have a rig for that. And if it's really hard, I might drop deeper. But by having rigs to cover all three, which I generally have in a match, what I can do is, if I find that by starting in 3.5 foot, I have issues, I have some liners, I have some problems with too many fish present, then what I can do is I can move into shallower water further across the canal and sort of concentrate those fish a little bit more, because they've got less water to come off the bottom and intercept your bait. It's a lot easier to keep them on the bottom when there's lots of numbers present. And of course, vice versa as well, if there's very, very few fish present, and on the colder days when they may want to be in that deep water, if nothing's happening on my initial 3.5 foot line, I've always got the option of dropping down into deep water to try and find the fish if I need to. So it'll very, very rarely happen that there'll be fish shallower and you won't get indications on your 3.5 foot, but it will often happen that they're deep and you don't see anything on your starting rig. And then aside from that, when it comes to changing rigs, or not changing rigs, changing lines, where I can go from is if my 3.5 foot's proved to be best, where the fish seems to be present, then that's the rig that I'll make my new lines with later in the day if I need to do that. So I'm not a big fan of that. That's another subject for another day. But yeah, I can judge by the 3 depths which was best, and then when it comes to making lines and chasing F1's around, I can resort to the best rig and I can go from there. So it gives me a very clear understanding of how my day needs to pan out, just by having 3 different depths covered and just feeling your way in, seeing what's best.